Hello, my name is Tim Forsyth. I'm a professor at London School of Economics and Political Science. Today I'm going to be talking about environmental institutions, and in particular the challenges for institutional theory of dealing with multi-level environmental governance in ways which include diverse understandings of resources and diverse social actors. I'm going to be arguing three things. First, the existing approaches to institutional theory have been using ideas of global commons and rationality, which are increasingly challenged by debates from legal pluralism and value pluralism. Legal pluralism is the existence of multiple sources of political authority in the way in which regimes are made, and value pluralism is the idea that there are diverse ways of understanding and responding to resources rather than just one way. Now, secondly, climate change policies have already shown these changes taking place. In particular, the framework of REDD+, or reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, have contributed to the understanding of resources and institutions as being far more diverse than just carbon and forests alone. And these have therefore shown a lot of the challenges that we are talking about today. But thirdly, I want to argue that despite these changes, there are still important challenges for how we understand institutions, and in particular for how we define the global commons, because I think that there are still important progress to be made in diversifying how we understand what the global problem actually is. So first, I'm going to talk about institutional theory. Now, the early approach to institutions, as many of you know, arose out of concern about the tragedy of the commons. And the tragedy of the commons, especially as was written about by Garrett Hardin in 1968, painted a picture of the difficulty of protecting commonly used resources when you had a set of individuals using it for their own individualistic self-interest. Now, the challenge that Eleanor Ostrom and institutional theorists came to was the idea that institutions can actually present a solution to the tragedy of commons, because they offer ways in which users of a resource can regulate the use of that resource in a way which is also economically rational. So the argument of Eleanor Ostrom was that we shouldn't refer to the commons as open access resources. We should actually refer to them as common property regimes and common pool resources. The regimes is basically the system of rules operating on a common pool resource, which gives the right of users to use it within certain limitations, but also to exclude free riders who come in and use it for their own individualistic benefit. The point, therefore, is that institutions are in response to the idea of a globally threatened resource as a result of universalistic self-interest. Now, one of the things that came out of Ostrom's work was the way to implement these institutions. She described a series of institutional design principles, which are listed here, which are necessary in order to make institutions work in a way that can regulate the use of a common pool resource in a way that is transparent and trusted by all the users. So, for example, rules like clearly defined boundaries, the authority of the local governance institution to sanction anybody who breaks the rules, and so on. But she also referred to them as nested, and later on she referred to this as polycentric. Now, what this means is that you have the same kind of institution working at different spatial scales. So I have here the picture of the Russian doll, and the aim here is to show a very simple idea that you can have the same thing, but at different sizes which fit into each other, which is essentially what the Ostrom nested enterprise or polycentric governance is. It's the idea that you have rules which work at different spatial scales, but which are all congruent with each other. So the idea is that you might have a global commons dealt with by a global agreement, but then you have spaces for the nation state to contribute towards a global agreement by setting its own rules. And then it goes down to the level of the locality and the individual. And the aim here is to try and create a system which fits together and can be implemented locally, even though the objective might be globally. Ostrom also discussed that the properties of stationarity and storage can also help, and these basically describe the ability to know a resource and to know where it is. So a good example of all of this could be like fishing in the North Sea, where it's reasonably logistical to understand which fish species are affected and what the actors are, boats and countries, and to measure their nets and to measure how much fish came out of the ocean. And the point is that with those sorts of conditions, it is reasonably easy to create a kind of Ostrom-type regime which can govern the use of a resource in a communal way. Now, this has also been replicated, I think, within REDD+. So the objectives of REDD+ are to create economic incentives for integrating forests into global climate change policy. There is some debate as to whether Ostrom or economists were responsible for REDD+. I actually think they both contributed. But essentially the design of REDD+ in its early days, which this diagram shows, is largely a nested enterprise in the spirit of Ostrom, because you have the global commons, which is the atmosphere, and the objective is to mitigate gases by creating incentives for regulating forests. And the incentives are basically that you either protect existing forests or you increase to the size of forests, such as by planting new ones. And for each of those actions, you translate that into its carbon equivalent, and you get rewarded, as was earlier proposed, you get rewarded by the equivalent value in the carbon market. So the idea is that you basically have a financial incentive, economically rational incentive, to create more and more people participating in the REDD+ mechanism in order to contribute towards the objective of the global commons, which is a reduction of global greenhouse gas concentrations. And as you can see from this diagram, at each stage, there are property rights such as carbon certificates, and there are rules such as where you can do this and what types of trees, and there are sanctions for measuring and so on, okay, which is pretty much like the Ostrom design principle. But of course, there are various challenges with these ideas. In general terms, things have become a lot more diverse. Now, Ostrom herself has acknowledged this. Her later work after the 90s began to acknowledge this. So here she is with Amy Petit saying that we can't believe in one set of ideal institutional design principles. Diversity matters. And I think that's a very important point to take on board, that Ostrom said that. But in addition, there are lots of other criticisms from other disciplines or from other directions. So for example, many anthropologists and sociologists have talked about value pluralism. Now, value pluralism is the idea that you can't simply talk about forests, for example, as carbon. For many countries like Indonesia and Brazil, the forest borderlands are not just zones for planting, timber or carbon sequestration, but rather they are livelihoods. They're space for agriculture. They can be lifestyle choices. They can also be biodiversity, all these other things which aren't necessarily included. Now, the point here is that there can be all sorts of rational reasons for treating resources in this way, but they're not necessarily driven by the economic reality or economic rationality of trading it for financial gain. And it's not just focused upon one aspect of a resource, such as carbon. The point being is that if you have an institution designed to target one aspect of a resource by using one avenue of rationality, then it's unlikely to work for all the different uses of that resource and all the different rationalities which exist for it. Another thing is legal pluralism. And the point of legal pluralism is the idea that you get different political authorities issuing rules and regimes. It's not just collective community action, like Ostrom said, or the state, but it can also be various other authorities with different objectives. For example, religious authorities might put rules upon sacred forests or the use of certain pasture land. Village councils might have historic reasons for regulating pasture. You might have state production forests driven by other rationalities. And then you might have international agreements like biodiversity or something relating to something else. And all of these things overlap. The point being is that stationarity and storage are not universal. Rationality is not universal. And out of all this comes yet another framework of institutional bricolage. Now, bricolage basically means the putting together of things. And institutional bricolage says that rather than trying to build new institutions based upon economic rationality, policymakers should simply take what is there already and seek to put it together and to strengthen it and make it speak more and more towards a common objective. So the idea here is that you might take state-based institutions simultaneously as local community institutions, put them together, international institutions, and together you'll create various webs of governance, but which will be stronger in certain places than others, but you build on them over time. So a good way of looking at these together could be these two diagrams. On one side, you have the nested enterprise of Ostrom, which is all based upon the Russian doll type model of one system fitting inside another and another, based upon the idea of chasing after the single objective, in this case, carbon, because that's what global greenhouse gas concentrations is all about. And on the other hand, you've got legal pluralism, which is much more to do with diverse objectives from diverse actors with diverse authorities. But nonetheless, putting it together makes a useful mishmash of different regulations and rules, which then gives policymakers or local authorities the ability to enhance and connect and strengthen all their ways of acting together, so that cumulatively they may meet the same objectives as a nested enterprise, but through a more diverse set of reasons. Now, this affects climate change policies. Now, there's been huge changes in the objectives of climate change policy. Here, for example, is a quick summary of differences between Kyoto in 1997 and Paris 2015. The obvious differences are that Paris was aiming to target all the countries, to include actions inside each country, as well as global objectives at the same time. Paris was also influenced much more by development, because the developing countries needed to be involved. Therefore, adaptation was involved, and also the funds for capacity building and local addressing of vulnerability locally. Kyoto didn't do that. Kyoto was focused very much upon reducing the greenhouse gas concentrations by allowing a few incentives for countries to participate. Now, the key differences are between the words systemic and cumulative. I'm going to talk about those now. So systemic is basically after the work of Billy Lee Turner in 1990, who defined two ways of talking about global problems. A systemic global problem is one where everybody experiences the same problem because there's an underlying physical system. Whereas a cumulative problem, on the other hand, doesn't have an underlying physical system, but is happening everywhere and therefore is global for that reason. But it has a crucial difference, because a systemic problem is one that can be caused at any one point in the world, but it will affect the rest of the world. And it can also be solved in a part of the world, because that will also affect the rest of the world. Whereas cumulative problems, on the other hand, can only be solved in the place where they're happening. So deforestation, for example, is a classic cumulative problem because it's happening in most countries, but you can only solve deforestation by going into the country where it's happening. You can't solve deforestation in Brazil by stopping it in Botswana. So therefore, the challenge is what does this mean for global commons? Under a cumulative approach, there is no one definition of a global problem. There are multiple things happening in different places. Now, this is also the trend in the IPCC reports. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has for some years now been highlighting that the old model of risk based upon greenhouse gases alone is now changing, and we have to incorporate other factors such as local vulnerability. Here's a quotation from the 2014 Working Group 2 report, which basically says that the old model of risk has to go, and you have to diversify it with ideas of local vulnerability. Now, all of this is important because what's happened since the early days of the institutions is that we now have a situation where more and more people are acknowledging that we can't simply talk about the global commons when it comes to climate change. By all means, global greenhouse gas concentrations are important and are driving many of the changes, but the things that make those concentrations problematic are often local contextual issues of vulnerability, poverty, inequality, which need to be addressed in those locations and which are not necessarily addressed simply by reducing greenhouse gas concentrations. Now, this has been the case with the transition in REDD+, which is the early idea, of course, in the early 2000s, was that it was a pretty sensible way to integrate forests into global climate change policy by offering economic incentives. The trouble is that there's been two sets of challenges. The first is that from its own framework, it's been difficult to achieve because you need lots of baselines to demonstrate additionality. So the idea of if you increase forest areas, you need photographs, records, etc. But also you need to make sure that things are monitored effectively, and that can be very challenging, especially in authoritarian regimes, which also tend to have large forest areas. Also, the carbon price hasn't yet justified the understanding of why REDD+ is economically attractive. But in addition, there's lots of criticisms from outside. In particular, NGOs like the World Rainforest Movement, Forest Peoples Programme, Rights and Resources Initiative have represented various concerns about how REDD+ can also be a form of green grabbing, in the sense that you're basically displacing users of land in hot developing countries where trees grow fast in order to sequester large areas of carbon, when those countries themselves don't actually have any contribution towards that carbon level. So the argument there is that you're using a rather reductionist definition of what the resources are for in order to justify the mechanism, but also you are overlooking the politics of how these decisions get made. That frequently the decisions to locate a carbon offset scheme or a REDD+ scheme are not just driven down by the economics of whether it makes sense to lock up land into timber and then sell the carbon credits, but it's actually driven by a whole set of agreements between the state and investors, and by trends in agricultural commodities in particular, all of which complicate the ways in which decisions are made. It's not just down to the economic logic, it's often down to the real politics of how the state works in different parts. So unsurprisingly, there's now a push towards different forms of institutions. One of these is the landscapes approach, which is being discussed by the Centre for International Forestry Research, CIFOR, and the World Agroforestry Union, ICRAF. And the aim here is to create an equivalent form of institutional framework to REDD+, but without the insistence upon economic rationality and with a far more diverse set of objectives. It's not just how do we sequester carbon quickly using incentives, but it's more to do with the political process of deliberation and discussion and negotiation between different interests to create an outcome that people can be happy with. This does not reject REDD+. There can be a place for REDD+ within a landscapes approach, but it also means that there's a place for livelihoods or for other activities like biodiversity reserves or the regulation of agriculture as well, and the emissions which come from things like fertilizer. And as this quotation from Jeff Sayer and his colleagues show, that it's basically an evolving outcome of ongoing negotiation. It's an optimistic framework which basically says that we can sit down and work out a solution, and possibly that's too optimistic, but it comes from the very different direction of basically saying that we have a global commons, we need to protect it by installing economically rational incentives. One example could be the landscape in the photograph, which is a soy plantation in Mexico. And the women involved in the photograph have been involved in trying to negotiate to protect forest areas whilst the agriculture is growing further and further. The argument here is that this is much closer to what's actually happening in the world than the institutional theory of REDD+ in its early days. So the argument here is that we're moving from the idea of nested enterprises into reality that everything is institutional bricolage, that the landscapes approach is bricolage, and also REDD+ is increasingly bricolage as well. The idea is that it's trying to work together with different pre-existing institutions to try and create a more carbon-friendly approach to those same institutions. So many REDD projects are incorporating old national parks. for example, but also that new agriculture expansion might be done in a way which respects principles of generating fewer gases and so on. What's interesting about this is that it's engaging with the whole world of agribusiness and value chains. So the idea that companies like Nestle, which grow cocoa or palm oil in different parts of the world, or buy it from different parts of the world, can get involved in influencing the growers of those commodities in order to protect landscapes and to sequester carbon at the same time. The challenge is whether this can actually include or crowd out the small holders. For example, there's some research by Peter Newell and his colleagues, for example, which says that climate-smart landscapes in South America tend to favor the large agribusinesses because they're flexible enough to change their agricultural practices, whereas smallholders and traditional agriculture still use fire and a lot of tilling of the land, which can release more gases. So there is this sort of political economy as to who wins from this, and one of the objectives of a landscapes approach is ideally to include those voices. So what I'm trying to say here is we've had this transition. Basically, REDD+, systemic, aiming to reduce concentrations, inspired by Ostrom, nested enterprise, single commons view of carbon, based upon economic rationality. Landscapes approach is more diverse. It's cumulative because it's trying to manage local experiences to achieve global outcomes. It's based upon legal pluralism and bricolage, multiple purposes, livelihoods, biodiversity, and indeed even gendered labor standards in new working standards of plantations, for example. All of these things can be included. It's much more diverse, addressing a larger number of actors and interests. The challenge is that this means dealing more with the politics of what goes on in these countries and of governing international trade flows in agricultural commodities, rather than dealing in the ideal world of economic rationality and what's best for the individual. So my conclusions are these, which is to say that institutional theories have changed a lot since the 1990s, because we now are dealing with diverse objectives and diverse actors. But there is a challenge. First of all, there is a need to develop new institutions to become more hybrid, to allow space for economic rationality when it is appropriate, but also to make sure they also deal more effectively with the politics of who's making the decisions in places where institutions emerge. In other words, who will guide the institutional bricolage. The other problem is that whilst we're discussing all of this, there is still a need to discuss who defines a global commons. There's still many factors, many assumptions going on about what is the problem, the objective that we're trying to deal with, what is the ultimate objective of all this institutional work. For example, the Paris Agreement is based largely upon the idea of achieving net zero emissions. Net zero doesn't mean no emissions. It means that you balance emissions from what part of your economy with the capturing of emissions from another part of the economy. Now, if this means that we end up going down the pathway of allowing cities and industries to keep on emitting, but that's okay because we're covering the rest of the country with lots of fast-growing trees, then that can be hugely exclusionary to the local people who work there and might want to have agricultural livelihoods in those places. Is net zero really the global commons we should be aiming for? Is it hiding political debate as to who wins and who loses? And if we ignore the people who lose, then we're probably guaranteeing that the policy will fail as well. Let me show you this as a place to end on. This is a photograph of a poster at the Bonn climate meeting in 2017. And it's from an organization called Plant for the Planet, which is trying to persuade policymakers to just stop the negotiations and just prioritize planting trees. And as you will see, it's got the youth of today telling the old people, including various famous celebrities, to shut up and just get on with the job of planting. Okay, so you might see, for example, Harrison Ford. There's also Rajendra Pachauri, who was head of the IPCC at the top, and so on, various other famous people. Now, the point there is that it's very much this message of the moment of saying, there's no time to talk, we know what we need to do, let's go ahead. But look at this next picture. This was taken at 2018 at the Global Landscapes meeting, also in Bonn. This is an activist from the Navajo people in North America, a woman who's painted this face, hand on her face to indicate that she's been told to shut up. Now, there's also some images there of violence against women, but also the whole idea of, marginalizing minorities. The point being is that I want to question how far global institutions should be based upon the idea of saying deliberation is bad. We know what to do, we just have to do it. I would actually argue that the key objective of today is to problematize our global assumptions. Yes, of course, there are many reasons to reduce global greenhouse gas concentrations, but it can't be done at any cost. And if we ignore the diversity of views about the ways of doing this, and we simply try to impose institutions which assume we know what the objectives are and the ways to achieve it, then we're all going to fail. So I'd like to leave you with the thought that actually talking is good, and institutions should be designed to increase trusted talking. Thank you.